I had a conversation with a young man who was an atheist, and he was a pretty strong atheist at that. And the question I asked him at some point, I said, where did you get all this stuff? And he gave me the list of things he had read or listened to. He didn't read much. First of all, I'm going to give you a resource. It's a great resource by a friend of mine named Greg Koukl, K-O-U-K-L. It's a book called Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. It's an apologetics book, but it's more how-to, as opposed to what do you say. It's more how do you say it. So I highly recommend this book to anybody who has serious conversations with people. And what he does is he shows fallacies. He shows also methods for dealing with folks like this. And here's the thing, I gotta tell you, I was that person. I was the person you're talking about. I was that person too. So here's the important thing, is that I think sometimes laying down ground rules in a conversation. And if they don't obey them, that's on them, and you can point it out later. So one of the ground rules is this, and this is an important one, is that I am going to commit to listening to understand, not listening to respond. Can you commit to the same thing? Are you going to commit to listening to understand, not listening to respond? Because almost all of us spend most of our time listening to somebody so we can respond to them, as opposed to listening to them so we can understand something, understand a person. Sometimes the best apology you can do is just be quiet and let them feel heard. Sometimes talk themselves out. Now, some folks don't talk themselves out, they just keep going. They're very Energizer Rabbit kind of thing like this. But they have to be willing to do the same thing you're willing to do. If they're not willing to do the same thing, if they can't commit to it, and in some conversations, I've done this before, where it's an ongoing, lengthy conversation. I had a Jehovah's Witness come to my house every Monday for a while. I said, we're going to sign a piece of paper now. And this piece of paper says, I commit to the following rules. And you're going to sign it, and I'm going to sign it. And when they don't, like, hey, remember this? It's a very poignant way to point out, hey, you committed to this. That's the first thing. I think he's trying to commit to a set of ground rules. The second thing is this, is that if it starts to get hostile, if it starts to get fiery, it's okay if it gets animated. I mean, we're talking about important topics here. But here, I have a follow-up question. Something like that is, it sounds, given the tone, what I get from you is that you're interested in an argument. And I don't mean providing argumentation. You're interested in a quarrel. And I'm not interested in that. So give me an example. I was speaking at a university. One of my first or second times speaking at a university. And I was doing a dialogue with a Muslim on God and evil and suffering. And there was a guy in the back, a Muslim guy in the back, who heard me speaking, and I was using different philosophers and different logic issues and all that stuff for my answer for the Christian faith. And you could hear him. He was doing one of these things where he's whispering, but not really. He's whispering like this. You know, to his friend next to him. I could totally hear him in the back of the room. And I knew that this guy would be the first guy to run up as soon as we're done to come up and confront me. And he did. He shot up and like almost ran like an Olympic power walk down the aisle at me, just barking at me. And he says, you use philosophers and you use logic and all this stuff, but you use something so stupid, you believe something so stupid as the Trinity. How could you believe something so dumb? And this is how it started. This is going to be a fun conversation. So he walks up to me, a crowd forms instantly because they're going to watch the MMA fight. You know. So I said, whoa. You asked a really important question about the Trinity, which I think is one of the most, if not the most important thing about God, is his triune nature. So it's an incredibly important question. So my question back to you is this. Given the hostility, given the anger and the volume with which you asked the question, it sounds more like an objection. So do you want a conversation or do you want to fight? Because if you'd like to fight, there's a perfectly good brick wall right there. If you run as hard as you can with your head first into that wall, you'll get the same result. It won't move and you'll get a headache. But if you're interested in a conversation, that's a different story. Now, we had a conversation. I sort of shamed him into it. And he said, no, I want to have a conversation. I said, great. So that requires you and I listen to understand, not to respond. But then if we have a response, do it after you've listened to understand. Do you agree? And we ended up agreeing. We had a wonderful conversation. And the reality was he didn't move. He didn't change his opinion. He didn't change his mind. I don't care. It's not for me to change his mind. It's for the Holy Spirit to change his mind and me just to be faithful in the process. But there was a young woman who was standing next to him, a Muslim woman standing next to him the whole time, and she didn't move. And he left, And she stayed with me and this crowd of people for 3 hours or 2 hours, something like that, talking about this thing, and she was so open. It's what Lee Strobel calls ricochet evangelism. The gospel hits a hard heart and it smacks off and finds a soft one nearby. So in this conversation, you might actually realize that the audience is someone who you didn't intend. So I think that's the ground rule there. And at some point, and this is a matter of prayer, every single time, you may need to walk away. Because sometimes you cast the pearls before swine. This is easy to say, it's very hard to do. So don't use the pearls before swine thing as a reason not to talk to somebody who's difficult. Don't do that. But submit it to prayer, because there may come a time when Greg Koukl calls them the steamroller, where you point it out, and then at some point you say, wait, hold on. I've already mentioned you steamrolled me, and if you do it one more time, I think we're going to have to be done. And either they stop it or they keep going. If they keep going, it's like, I'm done. Because the Lord's got to work on them a little bit more as well. So I would just say, we have to listen to understand, they have to listen to understand. And that creates real meaningful dialogue. And there's also an element to which you affirm something they believe and then show maybe that what they believe doesn't make any sense in their worldview. And the third thing is this. I had a conversation with a young man who was an atheist, and he was a pretty strong atheist at that. And the question I asked him at some point, I said, where did you get all this stuff? And he gave me the list of things he had read or listened to. He didn't read much, actually. He mostly listened to their various YouTube videos of the things. And so my question was, have you listened to anyone else? And the answer was no. So let me get this straight. You listen to only atheists and surprise you think they're right.
Right.
Have you listened to the Christian response? Now sometimes they'll say yes, and I found it wanting. Great, who? What arguments? Tell me. What arguments have you listened to? Who have you talked to? What books have you read in response to these things? And where did you find them deficient? And that's fine, if they did that, that's great. But oftentimes I found that a lot of folks, Christians included, listen to only their side, and therefore listen to characterizations of the other side by people who are on your side. So we have to be careful not to do this. In fact, the best seminaries in the country often will require their seminarians to read Bertrand Russell, one of the most influential atheists of the past 200 years. Because we want to understand and respond to the real thing, not a fake thing. And if someone's only listening to their side, then it's a motivation question. Are you interested in seeing if this was true? If Christianity is true, would you believe it? And that's a good question to ask them too. If it were true, would you believe it? Now, they'll be magnanimous and say, oh yes, of course. But you know and they know. That isn't always the case.